All right, this PowerPoint presentation is on the agricultural or Neolithic Revolution. This will correlate with Chapter 13 in the Essentials textbook, and it slightly correlates with Chapter 15 in the Explorations textbook. All right, so let's talk first about the transition between humans hunting and gathering as their primary mode of subsistence or getting their food to eventually domesticated food production of both plants and animals. So we know based upon evidence from the fossil record and the archaeological record that the last ice age ended approximately 10,000 years ago, 10,000 years before present. So during this time, our climate became warmer and more stable. And with this, as ice sheets are melting, carbon dioxide levels rose, which allowed for increased plant productivity and allowed for plant cultivation. Because as part of the process of photosynthesis, plants will take in sunlight, carbon, and water, and then release oxygen. So this transition from hunting and gathering to domesticated food production or agriculture has been considered a very fundamental threshold in the evolution of human societies, and we'll talk about why. It obviously changed the way that we get our food. It has changed the way that we live in sedentary villages rather than being nomadic, moving around, following the migration patterns of the game, the animals that we hunt, or even the plants that we cultivate. So we'll look at why did humans decide to adopt agriculture? Was it due predominantly to environmental and climatic fluctuations? Did the environment become more stable, which then allowed for increased plant productivity and allowed us to take advantage of this new subsistence form? Also increases in population, so we can document population explosion over the last 10,000 years. So we went from a population of thousands of humans to over 7.5 billion people on the planet today. All right, so hunter-gatherers in the early Holocene are still largely mainly nomadic. So they're moving seasonally, following the migration patterns of the game, of the animals that they're hunting. And in the early Neolithic, we begin to see evidence for, at first, temporary occupation of sedentary villages and eventually year-round occupation. So early on, humans were doing both. They were likely hunting and gathering during some seasons, and then maybe during the warmer season, when plant cultivation was more productive, they were staying more sedentary and cultivating crops. So this term revolution sometimes implies that it was dramatic or sudden, but in reality, the Neolithic revolution may have been much more gradual. So let's talk about some of the positive and negative consequences of this transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture. So some of the positives, so obviously a much more reliable food source. Humans were able to create a food surplus. And with this, when they're cultivating plants, they're living in more year-round sedentary villages. So this sedentary lifestyle meant that they were able to have shorter birth intervals. When hunter-gatherers are traveling long distances, sometimes 7-8 miles a day, just to gather enough food for survival, this led to longer birth intervals because both men and women had very high caloric demands. They were burning a lot of calories just traveling, but living in sedentary villages, having a more stable homestead essentially allowed them to shorten their birth intervals. And with this, since they're not spending every waking hour just acquiring enough food, they have more leisure time. So we're going to see the emergence of more and more examples of symbolic expression, anywhere from cave art to statuettes to elaborate pottery, etc., etc. So some of the negative consequences, it wasn't necessarily a huge problem in the beginning, but definitely population explosion, I think we can all agree, is certainly one of the main environmental problems that we face today with over 7.5 billion people on the planet. Sanitation issues, so it's kind of gross to think about, but when you're hunting and gathering, if you're nomadic, if you need to use the restroom, you just use the restroom and move on. But if you're living in a sedentary village, they all of a sudden have to figure out how to handle both animal and human waste in a way that's not going to make people sick. Nutritional issues, this sometimes surprises students. Actually, when we transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture, there's a lot of evidence that humans started to struggle with iron deficiencies and other types of nutritional deficiencies because all of a sudden we're focusing in on eating just a few different crops maybe just wheat or just barley or just rice, rather than the very mixed, varied diet of a hunter-gatherer. Infectious diseases increased. Disease is a density-dependent factor. So if humans are living in sedentary villages in much closer proximity to one another, it's much more likely that they're going to spread a virus or something that's going to make other people sick. Social inequality. This is sometimes another element that surprises students. Sometimes it's difficult to see the connection between the transition to agriculture and social inequality. But when you really think about it, it does make sense. All of a sudden, humans are owning property. They're competing over access to the most fertile land that will be productive to growing crops. So humans are acquiring property, competing over property, and sometimes violence is erupting because of this. All right, so complex societies do not develop in isolation. They emerge as networks. So with these networks, we have these various groups of agriculturalists that are starting to claim their piece of land, practice domesticated food and animal production. So this required much more complex social organization and division of labor. We also see evidence for the emergence of leaders, or they're sometimes called aggrandizers, the origin of inequality in property ownership, both intra and inter-group conflict over both land and resources, because again, competing over access to land that is fertile and hopefully near a water source, which is very important when you're trying to cultivate a crop. This conflict sometimes escalated into warfare. We'll see some evidence for that. Alliance formations and trade networks also emerged. For example, one group might be very skilled at growing wheat, while another group may be very skilled at growing barley. Another group may be very skilled at producing the pottery that's necessary to store these grains. So if they can trade with one another, it benefits all of the groups. So kind of along with increased symbolism and a sedentary lifestyle, humans now have more time to specialize in crafts and to express themselves symbolically. All right, so here are just some examples of some of the beautiful cave art that you see emerging. Some of this is even prior to the Neolithic or agricultural revolution, but I think it's all very beautiful, so I think it's fun to talk about. So in Europe and Africa, we see the emergence of cave art between about 30 to 40,000 years before present. It's sometimes debated whether Neanderthals could have possibly been producing some of this cave art, but you see the appearance of Homo sapiens in Europe by about 40,000 years before present. So it's of course debatable whether it was the Neanderthals or Homo sapiens that were producing the cave art. So in the European and African cave art, you see a lot of depictions of animals and weapons. So this could have been a way of creating a successful hunt, or essentially expressing their experience through their hunting. In Australia, and we still see some of these left in modern day, the Australian Aborigines created these stick figure drawings, these kind of anthropomorphic images that are essentially half animal and half human. So the Australian Aborigines believed that there was a time called the dreaming time, essentially where their ancestors quite literally created everything on the planet, from the mountains to the lakes to the streams, etc., etc. So these depictions are most likely of their spirit world connection and of their ancestors. So yeah, again, the Australian Aborigines created cave art representing the dreaming time. So this dreaming time is a primordial time when the world was forming. The spirits alive during the dreaming time created features of the landscape and human beings, and also taught people important elements about their culture and their beliefs. Very interesting to think about, if you have a religious or a spiritual belief that your ancestors quite literally created all of your natural surroundings and it inspires a much deeper connection to the landscape. These are just some more examples. This is Chauvet Cave in France. So again, European cave art, you're seeing a lot of depictions of animals and possibly creating a successful hunt. This is the Hall of Bulls at Lascaux Cave in France. So this one's a little closer to when we get to the Neolithic, about 12,000 to 17,000 years before present. Another image of the Hall of Bulls. So you start to see the emergence of figurines or statuettes. Some very famous ones are the Venus figurines. So the European sculptures originate around 30,000 years before present. And there's many hypotheses about what these may represent. So some hypothesize it may represent pregnant women and promote fertility. They have sometimes even been interpreted as erotic representations or even self-portraits. So just some more examples. That's the Venus of Willendorf and the Venus of Rassempouy. This is some Neolithic art here, so we're definitely getting into the age of agriculture here. So we have a Neolithic plastered skull. The eyes are made of shell beads. So these are just some more examples of the type of symbolic expression you're seeing emerge with the Neolithic. And pottery, of course. This one, some pottery can be very beautiful. This one looks like more of a functional piece of pottery. Because if you can imagine, if you're cultivating crops and growing grain, you need a way to keep it dry to prevent it from molding. Also, of course, with pottery, you can then transport water. You could transport water to give to humans, and you can also transport water that would be necessary for cultivating crops. All right, so let's look at the two scenarios, essentially what came first. Did the large population size come first, or did agriculture come first? So generally, scenario 2 is more supported in the archaeological record, but we'll talk about both. So scenario 1 assumes that human population size started to grow first, and essentially this larger population size created the need for humans to intensify their subsistence strategies in order to survive. So they needed to feed more people, so they realized that hunting and gathering may not be able to do that successfully, so they needed to intensify their strategies to create a food surplus that they could rely on in times of shortage. Scenario 2, which is the more supported one by the archaeological record, states that the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture came first, and then the larger population size came after. So essentially, like we talked about before, agriculture allowed for a food surplus, for a more reliable food source. It relied for a more sedentary lifestyle, which allowed for shorter birth intervals. So if you have shorter birth intervals, that means that reproductive success is increasing. So reproductive success increases, and over time, human population size increases and eventually explodes. Over the last 10,000 years, population sizes have gone from the thousands to over 7.5 billion people on the planet. So obviously this population pressure increased the need for a larger and more stable resource. Whatever came first, whether it was larger population or agriculture, humans are now finding themselves in the position that they need to feed more people more reliably. Plant domestication occurred in at least 10 to 11 regions around the world. You see it first emerge in a region called the Fertile Crescent, which is essentially what you know in modern day as the Middle East. So there's a video clip I'm going to have you guys watch. I'm not going to show it here in this PowerPoint presentation, but it's available in your module. It's a really good video clip from a series called Stories from the Stone Age. And it's about a 9-10 minute clip, and it really does a nice job of showing you what this transition might have looked like, the transition from humans relying on hunting and gathering to now relying more on crop cultivations. And it talks about one of the early Neolithic populations, the Natufians, that lived in the Fertile Crescent. All right, so end of the Pleistocene, so essentially end of the last ice age, saw intense harvesting of wheat and barley's ancestors, and these are still the primary crops that we rely upon today. 10,000 years later, so this manipulation of plant growth cycles began about 11,500 years before present. You see it first in the Jordan Valley, and agriculture spread across the Fertile Crescent by about 8,000 years before present. So some of the early villages eventually developed into cities. So some of these earliest cities are Jericho and Châtellerault. So just so you can visually see what we're talking about here, the Fertile Crescent, and the reason they call it the Fertile Crescent, it's this area in purple here. It's essentially kind of a crescent shape. So you're seeing Châtellerault here, which is one of those early agricultural cities. And this is the region where we see the emergence not only of plant domestication, but later, a little bit later, also animal domestication. And we'll talk about that later on in this PowerPoint. So we're at kind of a good stopping point. Let's go ahead and pause here. So this is the end of part 1 of the PowerPoint on the agricultural or Neolithic revolution.